Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming and more Shadow of the Erdtree. Today we've got something a little bit different for you for the current patch of the DLC. We're looking at the Ashes of War of the game. So that's new options in the DLC, sure, but also the best picks from the original ranked against each other in their current versions after current testing. To specify Ashes of War, this is something you can apply to different weapons, any that can take them, rather than unique weapons with unique weapon skills. There's also a massive amount of top tier Ashes in this game, so for this tier list we have S plus down to B because we're not even talking about any C tier options. If they're even talked about, they're some of the best stuff you can use, but to the best of my ability I've culled this down to 15 options. And for context of what a good Ash of War is at this current stage, you do need to consider the DLC bosses, how they often ignore what you're doing, smaller punish windows in general, compared to the original game where you could definitely blindly Ash spam bosses a lot more, so that has changed some things a little bit. Some Ashes can still ignore the boss though, and some require timing, but the results are worth it, and so that's how we judge things. With that said, we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up from B, starting with a new one. This is Spinning Gravity Thrust, which does come from one of the new Remembrance bosses. Uniquely, you can actually take this Ash of War off of the weapon and then apply it to different picks, such as a colossal sword in the form of greatsword here, allowing for a slower, heavier hitting weapon to deal ticks of damage very quickly, suddenly turning it into a successive hit option, which does mean you could go for status like bleed, like I'm doing here with a colossal sword. Kind of awesome as a concept, especially when you consider the seriously impressive hyper armor that is going while using this Ash of War, meaning you can blindly trade into enemies and do what I just talked about, ignore whatever they're doing, and get all that DPS off and stagger potential too. The downside of this is you're going to get absolutely smashed while you're doing it, you're not immune, so if the trade is worth it, if you can combo into a stagger or time it right, sure, it's worth it, but at the same time you're going to get absolutely smashed if you do it at the wrong time against the wrong boss, especially in higher New Game Plus levels where you're going to get hit even harder. So that definitely caps its potential, but it's definitely very valuable to the right weapon and setup. Also down in B tier is a classic, we have Endure, which in short allows you to have sort of hyper armor, a lot of poise, and then trade with a setup that otherwise can't. Take a big heavy hitting weapon, apply Endure to yourself, and then smack them. Or the opposite, take a super fast successive hit build like the Pata weapon we're seeing here. With Endure, you can trade and get the ridiculous DPS, killing the target before the damage it does is a problem for you. So best used with a setup that's going to be willing to trade, but in this DLC where that's less viable than before, we keep it down in B tier. Also down in B tier then we have the classic Royal Knight's Resolve, which essentially buffs up your weapon, and then for the next few seconds, one hit is going to be enhanced to deal more damage, so it's generally used by a couple of the big bonk weapons. There's a new one in the DLC called Bloodfiend's Arm that I like it on, charging up one big heavy hit and making it deal as much damage as possible. It's definitely not used in a massive amount of builds, but for the few heavy hitters that do use it, it literally makes spamming heavy attack more effective, and it's absolutely meta in those specific builds. Lastly, for B tier, I'm going to talk about Square Off, although I want to also acknowledge Unsheathe in the same kind of topic. Basically, what Square Off does is you hold the stance and then you unleash it. Generally, you're going to do the heavy attack follow-up rather than the light as a thrust kind of uppercut. This has seriously impressive stagger build-up, to the point where even if the damage was irrelevant, you do it just for the stagger. But with the right setup, of course, the damage is going to be good, and also your thrusting, potentially you could go for pierce damage here, counterattack damage potential is really good. By comparison, Unsheath does the same thing. You hold a position, you do light or heavy, you're probably going to do heavy, you deal nice damage, and then you also potentially stagger them. Unsheath by comparison is going to hit harder, but have less stagger buildup, and since I think the stagger buildup, especially in this DLC, is more valuable, I rate Square Off higher than Unsheath. But they're interchangeable. I also want to reference the fact that there's a new talisman in this DLC. It's Relena's Cameo. It's to do with stance setups like this, where you're holding the stance for a few seconds and then it charges it to make it deal more damage. That can be great for Unsheath and Square Off. The chances of you actually holding it rather than doing it multiple times in a row being worth it is debatable, but just an acknowledgement to that. Okay, so this brings us up to A tier, where we're now going to start talking about stuff that has effort to land, but the rewards are generally worth it. And I think Carian Sovereignty, that we have first here in A tier, is a great example of that. This is essentially the upgraded version of the Grandeur version, because it has a follow-up hit. What you're doing is you're charging a big magical blade up to 3 times and then slamming down with it. This version has a follow-up hit that's a horizontal swipe that is that triple fully charged without the time to actually do it. Very worth it if you can land it, but leaving yourself very exposed for a really long time to land this 2-hit combo. The damage is fantastic and the stagger buildup is great, and you even have better protection and poise potential yourself if you're using it with a greatsword specifically. So yeah, really high effort to actually get this to consistently land without trading and it being a problem because you traded, but if you get it off properly, the rewards are absolutely worth it. Moving on in A tier then, we have a new one, Wing Stance, which is also going to get that cameo buff of the new talisman, like Unsheath and Square Off. This one is specifically for your light greatswords, and you're probably using it, of course, with Milady. There's two versions here. You have the light attack combo or the heavy attack lunge thrust piercing damage. That is essentially what you're using it for. That lunge thrust deals great damage and brilliant stagger. You can entirely rely on it as your only source of damage using Milady. Of course, using combos where possible for extra DPS is worth it, and in fact, you can combo itself into itself. So you hold the stance out, you a light attack combo, and then immediately combo that into the heavy, the whole time holding L2 to continue the chain. That's what light greatswords are about, creating successive hit combos through that mix and matching nature. I still think it's somewhat similar to another one we're going to talk about in the tier above this that hits harder and has more stagger potential really, but I think it's super good and you can design an entire build around it. Just like the next one, Ice Spear. You see people use this with the classic Clayman's Harpoon, and essentially what you've got is a little shotgun blast around the initial use and then a medium to close range ice shot. That's going to deal great magic damage. It's also going to deal frost status build up. If they get the frost proc, they take a nice chunk of damage, and they have a debuff taking, I believe, 20% more damage while that is applied, allowing the next Ice Spear to hit harder. You can again design a build entirely around just spamming this, playing at close range and shotgun blasting in the short punish windows, because it's a relatively quick animation at that. It's still super strong and one of the best things you can do if you're running like a magic option or build in general. So I still rate it very high, but you know, it's not the best DPS option in the game, just a very good one. Similar to the last A tier pick, Waves of Darkness. To run this, essentially what you're going to want is a big weapon, colossal or otherwise, infused with some kind of status. That could be frost, rot's even possible, or you could just go full into magic. The Ash of War has you slam down for a big hit, and then it follows up with these waves, which does apply the status. Let's say you went with a frost setup, you could scale better with strength than intelligence scaling, which might be better for a big bonk weapon. During this Ash slam down then, you do have solid poise protection during the initial bit, and you can follow it with a tap heavy to exit that slam and first wave with a kind of spin horizontal slap, extending the impact and hitting even harder during this burst. So that's the downward slam, 3 waves, and this follow-up swipe for about 5 hits in quick succession with a colossal weapon. That is obviously really heavy hitting. There's a lot of stagger potential there, and because it's applying all the things like weapon buffs and statuses through those waves, you can get some serious burst through that too. Now unfortunately the downward slam does have very small range on the hit. You can easily miss it, so timing and aiming it properly is important. The results are obviously worth it though, and again, that's the concept for A tier in general, so it fits really well here. Above it though, in S tier, we consider these instantly super effective on use, but S plus is just, you know, higher output by comparison. So with that in mind, our first new Ash for S tier is Flame Spear, ideally used on your Fire Knight weapons, which get extra enhancements for being fire buffed up, and Flame Spear automatically buffs the weapon in fire after use. It's this incredible thrust attack that gets extra range via a kind of flame thrust follow-up, though ideally you want to hit with the weapon and the flame thrust itself to double up on the damage and stagger potential. It's a great gap closing punish, super quick and effective even in the shortest punish windows, super heavy hitting, and again great stagger potential, as well as it being a kind of thrust. If you've got a piercing setup, you could be hitting with the hardest damage type. So I absolutely love this and I rate it super high, and I find it hard to run anything but this Ash and say the new Fire Knight's Greatsword, a colossal sword. I love this combo. It's so easy to use and so effective. It's just not S plus because it doesn't have the busted kind of DPS potential those have, but it's definitely very much up there. Exactly like the next one, Blind Spot for your backhand blade type weapons. In short, this causes you to iframe dodge, then thrust into the target. This could be counterattack damage, potentially piercing damage as well. Something as easy as this allows you to evade whatever's coming at you while dealing your own respectable return attack too. Technically, you could just spam this back to back and hope that the iframes just protect you while you deal your damage, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's the fact that it keeps you on target with a perfect dodge better than a roll. It repositions you to their flank or even back for a free follow-up, maybe a light light attack combo or charged heavy or whatever, and the moment you're about to be hit, you can press it again to evade, making yourself an annoying buzzing fly that never stops DPSing. I absolutely love it, and it's the key reason why, say, the backhand blades are so rated highly in the DLC and in general. But again, per hit, you're not getting broken DPS, just really reliable hits. Also in S tier then, we have cragblade, which is going to buff up your weapon with this kind of stone effect, increasing the stagger value that's behind it. This is comboed with a variety of heavy hitting weapons, ideally with a setup that's going to cause stagger super quick, whether that's a colossal weapon or something like the star fists or other fist weapons with their really quick heavy attacks to charge staggers into the target. It is essentially just a really effective poise related buff. It's going to make that key concept of breaking poise on a target even easier. So it's been one of the best Ashes of War in the game for a long time. Much like Giant Hunt, which I have in S rather than S+. That is because it competes directly with another one we're going to talk about, and we just don't think it's as competitive with that. Still, it's obviously one of the best Ashes of War in the game because what it does is cause you to gap close with a moving forward thrust and uppercut style attack. Against many enemies like a humanoid, that will also send it flying. But it doesn't have as much value in this DLC compared to the original game. You can't send a humanoid like that flying so much in the DLC, where you're consistently fighting bigger, stronger enemies of that nature. Still though, it's a thrust gap closer. With the right weapon, this could be potentially pierce damage, and that could potentially also be a counter attack. The way that it positions you allows you to actually use the movement to dodge the enemy's attack and get a counter through that method. As you can see though, the reliable, spammable, really effective damage that this provides is nuts, and that's why it's arguable for S+. It's also obviously going to generate consistent staggers, and it's just super easy to use. It's kind of like the wing stance leap heavy attack I talked about earlier, but harder hitting because you'll be using it with bigger weapons. So I still really like it, and it's definitely at very least S tier. Just like the Bloodblade, which has only got better in this DLC. The reason for that is there's a new armor set called the Ansbach set, which will enhance dynastic attacks and also blood skills such as this one. I believe it's 3% increase per piece of Ansbach gear. So with a bleed setup, you probably have 3 of those on for at least a 9% increase alongside the white mask and, you know, getting the bleed proc AR from that. Bleed builds that can benefit from that have only gotten better, and Bloodblade's basically one of the best. You craft your own Reduvia with a harder hitting weapon than a dagger, and then just spam this like a shotgun. If you hit with the weapon and the blade itself, it'll double up the effect, and that's super easy to do because it's a really quick animation. You can spam it back to back to back. So it's great utility and really effective, and only better in the DLC. I also want to reference Bloody Slash here because it's better as well for the same Ansbach reasons. But I do think Bloodblade is better because it has better range, generally safer to use, and also Bloody Slash will hurt you a lot more. But it's also a really good option and could be probably like A tier or something. But that now brings us to the last picks for S+, starting with what I believe is still absolutely broken Seppuku. Stab yourself, deal some damage more than before, and pull out a now AR increased, more bleed status build up weapon. Not as strong as it used to be, and they also messed with power stance status build up in the past, and yet, as you can see, especially with curved swords, it's just absolutely busted beyond compare. This is one of the highest, if not the highest DPS things you can use to destroy a boss in the game. The only thing holding it back really is the short buff time, the fact that it hurts you so you have to use a heal after you buff up, and you know, not every enemy in the game is bleedable technically, just most of them. But the results still speak for themselves because this is just so much DPS and so simple and so effective. But our last pick for S+, we think it's Savage Lion's Claw / Lion's Claw. I want you to imagine this is either or because you're using them for different purposes. What you have is a spin flip that deals great damage, has poise protection during it, and builds a lot of stagger too. So you're able to put it on a big heavy hitting weapon, absolutely spam it into the target, dealing enough damage and stagger build up to trade effectively and ignore what they're doing. That makes it incredibly easy and incredibly effective at what it does. The difference between the Savage and normal version though is that the Savage will deal more hits, leading to more damage if all of them hit, where the regular Lion's Claw is going to be more damage on the first hit. So if you're using something that has any benefits from successive hits or status, well then you want to use the Savage version. But if you're just using, say, a big colossal weapon with high AR behind it, well then you want the big single hit that's going to be more effective, so you go with the normal Lion's Claw. So now you have more options based on the type of build that you have with the same Ash concept, but also it's better in the DLC because there's a new weapon, Freya's Greatsword, which will increase the damage of these skills by 10%. You could literally have that greatsword on your back, not really being used for anything directly, and and enjoy that damage increase if you're able to deal with the weight increase that'll provide. We think that Lion's Claw in general is very competitive with Giant Hunt, but overall rate the fact that there's now this Savage version and this damage increase from a new weapon pushes it over the edge and reaches S+ in our opinion. But there you have it. That's our lineup of 15, although we've technically mentioned 17 Ashes of War for this video. I better also mention now about Golden Vow, which is also a top tier Ash of War. There's an incantation requiring 25 faith to cast it, increasing your attack and defense. For the attack, it's a 15% increase for this incantation version. But then with the Ash of War version, it's only a 10% increase. So in every build I ever run, I try to have 25 faith. But if I can't do that, I will put Golden Vow on a dagger in the build and use that before the fight instead. This is a buff you use before the fight though, rather than something you use in the fight, so I figured I'd just mention it here at the end, rather than put it in the categories themselves. Speaking of which though, here's a few extra honorable mentions that could have been in C tier if we did that, or even more B tier options if we weren't limiting ourselves to just 15. Options like Prayerful Strike, Flaming Strike, Chilling Mist of course, or the Storm options like Storm Caller and Storm Blade, because there's a new talisman that enhances their damage by 10%. But frankly, there's probably like 30 incredible options we could talk about, but I do hope this was interesting and useful. If it was, do drop a like. If there's any you think we could have mentioned or added to these tiers, let us know in the comments. But for now, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thank you for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.